I chose the title of this evening's lecture to indicate that there is a choice that has to be made between God's law and man. It's in the form of a question, really, and to show you the options open to you and to start you thinking about which would it be more sensible to choose. That's quite a warm evening, so we're not going to do anything really difficult this evening. We're just going to look at God's law and man's, and as I say, let you decide which you think is the more sensible and the more logical to follow. And there has to be a choice. So if we just go to Matthew's Gospel and chapter 6, and Jesus makes a very short, plain statement here. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24. He's in the middle of a discussion or an explanation, and he makes this statement in verse 24. No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to one or obey one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And mammon there, in this instance, initially refers, or specifically refers to money, but you can also expand that out and say anything to do with the things of men. So Jesus states quite clearly, you have to make a choice. You cannot serve God and man at the same time. You can't have a foot in both camps. You have to make a decision about which law you follow. Now, I need to make it clear right from the start that we as Christadelphians are not advocating disregarding the laws of the land, doing what we want, choosing to obey which laws we obey and which we don't to gain advantage for ourselves. Because the Bible also makes it clear that as far as possible, we obey laws laid down by man unless they contradict those of God. And an example of this again is Jesus in, you turn a bit further into Matthew chapter 22. Might be worth keeping a marker in Matthew because we're going to be using his gospel quite extensively. And there's an example here that Jesus statement that he made. Matthew chapter 22, and we're going at verse 15. Then the Pharisees, they were the religious leaders of the time, took counsel how they might entangle Jesus in his talk. And they sent out unto him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, so this was a conspiracy really, Master, we know that thou art true, and teachest the ways of God in truth, neither carest thou for any man, for thou regardest not the person of men. We'll come back to that in a minute. And here's the clincher. So they're trying to set Jesus up. Tell us therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute or tax unto Caesar or not? So they said, okay, Jesus, you've said that you've got to make a choice, but what about paying taxes to Caesar? Do you obey that law or not? And if we go down, we find that Jesus very cleverly sidesteps them. And what he actually says to them, if we read on down, he catches them out in their own cleverness. Verse 18, but Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, why tempt ye me, ye hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny or a denarius. And he said unto them, who is the image and the superscription? But what's he asking that for? It's obvious. They say Caesar's. Then saith he unto them, render or give therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. So that again, there's a difference, isn't there? Yes, you give the things of man to men, you obey the law when you can, but if it's God's, it's God's. So again, there's a definite choice to be made. So if we obey man's law as far as we're able, there is going to come a time when there's a conflict between God's law and man's. And we can go back to the Old Testament to see an example of this in Daniel, the book of Daniel. Because Daniel believed very strongly in God, his faith was great. And if we go into Daniel chapter 6, we find Daniel in a similar situation to Jesus as we've just looked at. The leaders of these Daniels, they were trying to catch him out. They thought, here's someone who could be a bit of a troublemaker, we're going to catch him out in his own words. Let's go in at verse 4. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion or accusation against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. So they couldn't find anything that Daniel had done that was illegal, so to speak, in their own law. So I thought, what are we going to do? Then they said, these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. So they tried to change the tables round, as it were. Then the presidents and princes assembled together the king, and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents and the kingdom, the governors and the princes, councillors, captives, have consulted together to establish a royal statute, a new law, and to make a firm decree that whosoever shall ask a petition or pray to any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. So they thought, okay, we can't catch Daniel out on the current laws, we'll make a new one and we'll catch him out on that. So they said to the king, look, you need to make a law that if anybody prays to a god over the next 30 days, they'll be cast into the den of lions. And the king, very foolishly, without really thinking about it, agrees to this. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree. Verse 10, and when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chambers toward Jerusalem, he kneeled down upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. So Daniel didn't think, oh, they brought this new law, I'm going to flaunt it immediately. This was something he'd already been doing, and very clever these men had picked up on that, hadn't they? So they made Daniel really disobey the law of the land, which is quite crafty, isn't it? So read on down, so they go running off to the king, and they say, this man is flaunting, this Daniel that you hold in such high esteem, he's flaunting the law that you've just made. And if you read on down, you find that it backfires on them, and Daniel is saved by God. So it can happen that we will, or may, if we choose to follow the laws of God, come into conflict with the laws of man. Now hopefully we'll never perhaps have to make such a drastic choice as Daniel did, with such drastic consequences. But maybe if we go to Acts chapter 5, we may find ourselves in this situation. Acts chapter 5. And at the moment I'm only talking about Britain or England where we live now. Acts chapter 5, and we're going at verse 25, I think. Acts chapter 5. Exactly, well, very similar scenario. The leaders of the time, this is Peter and John had been proclaiming the gospel, preaching the gospel, and the leaders of the time, just at the same time as Daniel and Jesus, they weren't happy about it. It says, verse 25, then came one and told them, saying, the leaders, behold, the men whom ye put in prison are standing in the temple and teaching the people. Then went the captain with the officers and brought them without violence, for they feared the people, lest they should have been stoned. And when they brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, did we not straitly command you that you should not teach in his name, Jesus' name? And behold, we have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Says, we've told you that what you're doing is illegal. You're not listening to what we're saying. You're breaking the law of the land, or the religious laws of the time. And Peter's answer is exactly what we've been saying. And Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than man. So it's very clear, isn't it? Okay? We must obey the law of the land unless it contradicts those of God's. And if we choose to do that, make that choice, there may be consequences to it. Let's have a look at 2nd of Corinthians, just to the second letter to Corinthians in chapter 11. And here we find the Apostle Paul, who was a great preacher of the gospel, spread it among the known world at the time. Chapter 11, let's see what happened to him. He gives us a little précis of all the things that the problems he'd run up against preaching that were often against the instructions or the law of the lands that he was in. So 2 Corinthians 11, and we're going at verse 24. And this is what he says. Verse 23. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labours more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods, once was I stoned, thrice I suffered a shipwreck. Day and night I have been in the deep, in journeys often in perils of water. It's a great big long list of all the things that have happened to him because he chose to follow God's law and it came in to conflict with man. So it's not an easy choice to make. It's not something you can just say very casually, oh, I'll follow the laws of God. You need to think and understand the consequences and responsibilities of it. So what are we talking about here then? Well, we've read together the basis of God's laws. They're commonly called the Ten Commandments, aren't they? And I guess it's true to say that over the years, English law, and in other countries, Christian countries, the law has drifted away from the Ten Commandments. If you go back 100 years, 150 years, they were more closely akin to the Ten Commandments. But certainly over the last, I guess, 50 years, since probably maybe the end of the Second World War, the laws of certainly this land have drifted further and further away from God's laws. So let's look very briefly at the Ten Commandments. So back to Exodus chapter 20. So we're not going to do anything difficult, we're just going to have a look at them. And we're going to score, do a little bit of scoring here, to see how many of man's laws are still even remotely connected to that of God. So we'll go in at verse 17. Verse 1. And God spake all these things, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And here we go. Now, number 1 is thou shalt have no other gods before me. I'm not aware of any law in this country, and I can't speak about abroad, but there's certainly no laws in this country about who you can worship. People can basically worship anybody and anything that they choose. So we give that big fat 0. So the first commandment is that there aren't any laws now pertaining to that. Second commandment then. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the waters under the earth, and so it goes on. I'm not an expert on English law, but I've had a good look and I can't find any laws corresponding to that either. In fact, idol has become quite an acceptable thing, isn't it? I believe there's a programme, I seem to remember, called Pop Idol, where people are in competition to become the next star of the music industry. And we know that some people view even other people as almost godlike. For example, followers of Elvis Presley. He still has a group of fanatical followers, even though he's dead. If you believe he's dead, some people even go as far as say he's not actually dead, he's living somewhere else. So you can make an idol of anything you wish, anything at all. So again, the second commandment scores 0. Third one, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Now, up until 2008, there was actually the law of blasphemy in the British law statutes. And I looked this up, and there were pages and pages of it. It goes all the way back into medieval times, the law of blasphemy. There were some very well-known test cases for many centuries. You could pick them out. But we find that the last person in Britain to be sent to prison from blasphemy was John William Gott on December the 9th, anybody like to guess? 1921. Mr. Gott had 3 previous convictions for blasphemy when he was prosecuted for publishing 2 pamphlets entitled Rib Ticklers or Questions for Parsons and God and Gott. In these pamphlets, Gott made fun of the biblical story of Jesus entering Jerusalem, comparing Jesus to a circus clown who was found guilty, sentenced to 9 months hard labour. But then in 1949, Lord Denning made a speech, placed the blasphemy laws in the past, saying that it was thought that the denial of Christianity was liable to shape the fabric of society. There is no such danger anymore, and that the law offensive of blasphemy is a dead letter. And that's when people started to campaign for the law of blasphemy to be abolished. Took quite a while, and some of you may remember some incidences. There was a film that was called The Last Temptation of Christ, where some churches tried to bring the blasphemy law against the film. They failed. And then in 1998, the Human Rights Act 1998 requires the courts to interpret the law in a way that is compatible with the Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. The offence of blasphemous libel is believed to be contrary to the freedom of speech, and so you get the picture. It's starting to creep in. We want to get rid of this law of blasphemy. We don't think. And when the BBC decided to broadcast a programme called Jeremy Springer the Opera in 2005, they received over 63,000 complaints from offended Christians. There was one scene depicting Jesus professing to be a bit gay. The fundamentalist Christian Voice group sought a private blasphemy prosecution against the BBC, but the charges were rejected by the City of Westminster's Magistrate Court because it was an outdated law. They felt that they couldn't proceed with it. And then, as the final nail in the coffin, in January 2008, a spokesman for Prime Minister Gordon Brown announced that the government would consider supporting the abolition of the blasphemy laws during the passage of Criminal Justice and Immigration Bill. The government consulted with, this is a strange bit, the government consulted with the Church of England and other churches before reaching a decision. The move followed a letter written to the Daily Telegraph at the instigation of MP Evan Harris and the National Secular Society, and was signed by leading figures, including, rather bizarrely, Lord Carey, former Archbishop of Canterbury, who urged that the law be abandoned. Then in March the same year, peers voted for the law to be abandoned, and on May the 8th, 2008, the Criminal Justice and Immigration Act abolished the offence of blasphemy and blasphemous libel in England and Wales with effect from the 8th of July 2008. So again, we give that commandment a 0. You see the influence of man there. Man said, we don't like this law, this is not suitable for us, we'll get rid of it. We don't have anything to do with God or anything like that, we'll take it out of the statute books. So that was that one. Then we come on to the next one. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now when I was a boy, which wasn't that long ago I suppose, Sunday was a different day of the week. Most of all the shops were closed, even cinemas were closed, and you spent the day with your family, or you went to church. A lot of people went to church. But today I see a huge change in that Sunday is exactly the same as any other day now. Okay, you come into town, there's the same amount of traffic, all the shops are open. And again, man is very slowly trying to oust Sunday as being a particular day. God in the commandments said, you need one day where you can rest, you need one from your labours, you need one day where you put the time aside to think of me, to spend more time thinking of me. And we met this morning to break bread, didn't we? Now, of course, and Jesus also spoke about it. He said, look, you know, the Sabbath or Sunday is not to be a miserable day. Okay, as long as you dedicate the day to God and put Him first on a Sunday, then you can still enjoy yourselves. Okay, that's of course not to say that you don't remember God any other day of the week, but this was to be a particular day where you dedicate yourselves more to God. You concentrate on the things of God. There was a quote in the paper recently that said, more people going to shopping malls on a Sunday than churches. More people going to shopping malls today than go to church. So again, sadly, that law scores a 0. Not doing very well really. Number 5, honour thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land. I couldn't find any existing law to say that you have to honour your mother and father. And it's of note that it doesn't say what age your mother and father are. So there's no existing law for that, so we haven't scored anything yet. Number 6 then, thou shalt not kill. Now you might see in modern versions that they use the word murder. We haven't really got time to study that, but we'll look at what Jesus says about it later. Now, British law defines different types of killing: murder, manslaughter, lawful killing, such as a soldier does, but it condemns outright murder. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because man says, in this particular instance, it's against the law to kill, but if I put you in a uniform and give you a gun, that's lawful. Strange, isn't it? Okay. So I guess if we're going to be generous, we'll give that half a point, I think, shall we? Bible says thou shalt not kill. Man says you can kill in certain circumstances. We'll come back to it later, but we'll give it half a point, I think. Okay, number 7 then. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Now I'll look that up as well, because I remembered vaguely that it could be grounds for divorce, and it is. I've got the government paper on divorce, and I've trawled through it. They're all huge, great, massive documents, these things. Grounds for divorce. You must show there are good reasons for ending your marriage. You can give 5 grounds for divorce. I won't go into all of them, but adultery comes up, and this is the basic thing: is your husband or your wife has sex with someone else of the opposite sex, and you can no longer bear to live with them. I think that's straightforward enough. You can't give adultery as a reason for divorce if you've lived with your husband or wife for 6 months after you found out about it. Well, okay, so that puts a bit of a fly in the ointment, doesn't it? So basically it's saying, if you discover or you find out that your partner, your husband or wife has had sex with somebody of the opposite sex, then you can use it for grounds of divorce. We'll come back to that one later. That's quite interesting, that is. So it is really against the law regarding divorce. So we'll give it half a point, shall we? I think that's fair. Okay. Or should we give it 1 point? We'll give it 1 point. Let's be generous. Okay. That's the grounds for divorce. Number 8. Thou shalt not steal. Now this is an interesting one. There is the Theft Act. I didn't know all this. There is the Theft Act 1968. And it's huge because, where does it say? The basic definition of theft, which says, I've lost it now, it basically says what we think. If you take anything dishonestly or without the person knowing, that is considered theft. But then, because it's human law, it has to go into the different types of theft. Removal from articles from places open to the public, taking a motor vehicle, aggravated vehicle taking, stealing electricity. There's pages and pages of it. So, but basically it says that at the moment theft is against the law, so we can give that a point as well. So we're beginning to pick up with those. Some laws are still based on the Ten Commandments. So we'll move on then to the next one. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbour. And again, I thought about it. I thought that's called perjury, isn't it, in court? So I looked up the Perjury Act, 1911. And here it is. And this is the definition of perjury. If any person, in giving any testimony, either orally or in writing, otherwise than on oath, where required to do so by an order under Section 2, blah, 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 which is known to be false in a material particular, or which is false in a material particular, and which is not believed to be true, he should be found guilty of the offence of perjury and liable on conviction, on indictment, to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 2 years, or a fine, or both. And then there's pages and pages about what sort of perjury you can be accused or found guilty of. So we'll give that a 1 as well. And let's move on to the last one. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbour's. Well, it'd be almost impossible to have a law, because how do you know somebody's coveting something that belongs to you? The only time I guess it might be liable to prosecution if it leads to theft, murder, adultery, etc. So I'd have to give that a 1. There isn't actually a law I'm aware of that says you can't covet things. So I make that a score, if we're being generous, of 3.5 out of 10. It's not very good, really, is it? It's not. So we can see how far, and it continues to be a bigger gap, a drift away from the laws of God. We scored 3.5 out of 10, being very, very generous. We also need to understand and accept that the Ten Commandments were the basis of God's law, and they were designed to affect every aspect of your life on a very personal level. And as I said earlier, Jesus expanded on the Ten Commandments several times during his ministry to show, most importantly, that it was the spirit of the law that was more important than just blindly obeying the words on a page. Now, it's very easy not to steal, it's perhaps easier not to kill, but there's more to it than that. Let's quickly go to Matthew chapter 23. Matthew chapter 23, verse 23. Here Jesus comes again in a clash with the religious leaders of the time. And this was to do with God's law as well, but we'll see that they've changed it. We'll talk about that later. But he said unto them, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and aniseed coming, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, faith. These ought you to have done, and not to leave the other undone." So Jesus said, yeah, you've got the Ten Commandments, and you base your life on that, but not in an academic way. You have to take it to yourself personally. You have to extend it a bit further out. You have to apply it to yourselves, and not just use it as a card on the page sort of exercise. There's some examples there. If you go to Matthew chapter 19 and verse 17. And behold, one came and said unto him, verse 16. Behold, one came and said unto Jesus, "Good master, what must I do that I may enter eternal life?" And he said unto him, "Why callest thou me good? There is none good but God, but one, that is God. But if thou wilt enter into eternal life, keep the commandments." And he said unto him, "Which?" Jesus said, "Thou shalt not do no murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, honour thy father and mother." We've looked at these. "Thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself." And the young man was there. He got the answer straight away. He probably thought, "I'm on a winner here." The young man said, "All these things have I kept from my youth up. What lack I yet?" Jesus said, "If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell that thou hast and give to the poor. Thou shalt have treasure in heaven. Come and follow me." So take it a step further. You obey the law, that's great, but you need to take it a step further. The spirit of the law. Demonstrate the spirit of the law. When the young man heard these sayings, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. Go to Matthew 5. It's not just a case of deciding to obey God's law first or man's. There's more to it than that. So Matthew chapter 5, verse 18. "For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, not one jot or tittle shall in no ways pass from the law till all be fulfilled. Whosoever therefore should break one of the least of the commandments and teach men so, he should be called least in the kingdom of heaven. For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter the kingdom of heaven." So he said, look at the religious leaders of the time, look at the rulers of the time. They obey the letter of the law, they do not keep the spirit of it. He said, unless you take the law of God into yourselves, it affects your life, you're no better than these other people here. Now we need to make just take a little note there. Apply this to ourselves. So Jesus said on occasion, you've heard of it said in the old law, you should not commit adultery. He said, but if you look on a man or a woman with lust in your heart, you've broken that commandment. Okay, so you need to control it. You need to take it to yourselves. And then he took another example and said, you've heard of it said you should not kill. But if you're really angry with somebody without cause, then you're killing in your heart, committing murder in your heart. So the law of God is not just written on pages, it applies to us. We've got to put it into practice. They're very hard-hitting statements. We have to take personal responsibility for actions and go against what is termed our human nature. Now you might be thinking, well, that's all very well, and I accept that, or part of it, or whatever. But if the law of God's so harsh from a human point of view, why bother trying to live by the law of God? Why not just stick to man's? Which man's law, I guess, is an easier option. You can get away with things. You have to be found out with man's law. You have to be discovered, don't you? So what I would like to do for the second part is look at some aspects of both God's law and man's, and again see which it would be most logical to follow. Now, the complexity of both laws. Anybody in the room who's been involved in any way with our current legal system knows it's a minefield. Very complex. Even the simplest thing can become mind-blowingly difficult. In fact, the wording of a lot of legal documents, which I'll trawl through for this talk, is written in such a way to cause those outside the profession to read it several times before you actually begin to understand what it's saying a lot of the time. And even professionals working in the judicial system, they train for years, don't they? Once they've completed the basic training, then they go to specialise in a certain area of law, don't they? Much as doctors become specialists in a particular branch of medicine. So man's law is very, very complex. God's law is very simple, really. And anyone of average intelligence can understand the gospel message. Jesus was asked a question by a lawyer, a specialist in the law of Moses, religious leaders of that time, about the law. Now, they'd taken the law of God and they made it extremely complex and a burden for the people of the time. Ordinary people gave up. So I can't understand the law of God now, it's too difficult. And sadly, a lot of mainstream churches have made God's law equally complex and incomprehensible to a lot of people. Let's go to Matthew chapter 22. The gospel message is very simple. It's men and women that make it complex. Matthew 22, and let's go in at verse 34. And here again, Jesus, spent a lot of time discussing or fending off the tricks of the religious leaders. But when the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they gathered together. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him, saying, "Master, which is a great commandment in the law?" Now they, as I say, the religious leaders made it extremely complex. I thought this is going to be a good one. Jesus' answer was very simple. Jesus said unto them, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So he said, 10 commandments are there, which is, I'm not going to argue with that, but the basic law of God is you will love the Lord the God with all your heart and your neighbour as yourself, and that's it. Everything else is based on that. That's all you need to know, really, and you start adding on to it as your understanding grows. But if you understand that, then you have the message of God and the gospel. And Jesus actually condemns very strongly those that try to change God's law. Mark chapter 7. He uses extremely strong language. Mark chapter 7, just look at verse 7. Let's look at verse 6, really. Then again, another debate about the law of God that they'd made so complex. Jesus said in verse 6, he answered them and said unto them, "Well hath Isaiah prophesied of you hypocrites, as is written, this people honour me with their lips, they stick to the letter of the law, but their heart is far from me. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines," or the law of God, "the commandments of men." Or another version says, "You have let go of the commandments of God and are holding on to the traditions of men." And that's exactly what's happened to our law in this country. We've done exactly that. Okay? We've let go of the commandments of God and we hold to the traditions of men now. Now, unchanging I've put here, a little note to remind me. We know that man's law is constantly changing, isn't it? What was illegal even, say, 10 years ago is now completely legal. Take, for example, laws relating to homosexuality. They've been reversed due to human pressure from human rights, desire to ensure that nobody is discriminated against. It's highly likely that there will be a challenge in the High Court soon regarding adultery as grounds for divorce. Because remember, the grounds for divorce only for couples of the opposite sex. Okay? It's likely, very likely, that soon it will be changed to include same-sex couples. So the law has changed. Okay? For hundreds of years it's been that, now it's changed to include same-sex couples. Laws regarding the use of illegal drugs have changed many times through the last 25 years, because new laws have to be brought in to plug holes in existing laws and so on and so forth. Within my work, I've had contact with the police and courts, and I know that law is changing constantly. I have to go on training to make sure I'm staying within the law. A good example is the Mental Health Act, which is constantly being reviewed and tweaked, and you have to be on your toes. But you know, despite men's changing or complicating God's law, the Ten Commandments remain the same since the day Moses wrote them on the stone. As we say, people tried to make them more palatable by adding or taking things away, changing the meanings. But as Christadelphians, we firmly believe that they remain the same in today's technological, free-thinking world as they did in the time of the Old Testament. What about across the world? Are the laws the same the world over? Well, we know they're not, don't we? We have Interpol, which is an international law agency that tries to work across borders. But generally each country makes its own laws. You've only got to think of the laws of England versus law of Scotland. Completely different in Scotland. We won't talk about Wales, but the laws change. And even in England, bylaws can vary between counties. But I guess one of the best examples is in the United States, where between states laws can actually contradict each other. We think of the death sentence, death penalty in America, very complex. No continuity across the United States. But God's law is a truly international law. If we go to Acts of the Apostles, and chapter 2. And here we find the time of Pentecost, where the apostles are given the Holy Spirit, and there's lots of crowds of people in Jerusalem going into Jerusalem from all over the world. Let's go in at verse 5. And there were dwelling at Jerusalem Jews, devout men out of every nation under heaven. Now when this was noised about, the multitude came together and were confounded, because that every man heard them speak in his own language. And then there's verse 7, and they were all amazed and marvelled, saying to one another, Behold, are not all these which speak Galileans? And how hear we every man in our own tongue? And then it gives you a long list of all the places in the known world that people came from. Okay, so the gospel right from the start was intended to be spread throughout the world, and God gave the apostles special powers to enable them to do that. We've looked at Paul. He carried on the work, didn't he? And God's law was spread across the world, and still continues to be so. And it's interesting with Paul, isn't it, that when he spread the gospel across the known Roman world, he didn't change what he was saying, did he? He didn't go to, say, Italy and give a slightly different gospel because he was in Italy, or he went to Spain, didn't he? He didn't make a Spanish version of the gospel. The message he gave was the same all over the world. The laws and commandments that were included were the same, and that's exactly what God has intended. that it should be wherever in the world you are, you receive the same message. But as we've already pointed out, unfortunately, man, because he thinks he knows better, has tried to change the gospel message. Man's law is open to corruption as well, isn't it? It's only a very, very naive person would believe that the law is above reproach. We see regularly in the media cases of corruption and bribery within judicial systems around the world. And I guess while we're blessed with arguably a more rigorously motivated and honest system in Britain, it's still far from perfect. And we're all aware how fragile man's law is, isn't it? We've witnessed riots in major cities in this country where authorities temporarily lose complete control about what's going on in the city. Major fires, riots, looting and so on, because a substantial group of people decided we're not going to follow this law anymore, and anarchy can quickly take hold. We shouldn't ever be lulled into false sense of security in this country. Things could very, very quickly change. But God's law, as we sing in that hymn, God's law is perfect. It can't be open to bribery or corruption. Jesus demonstrated this. If we go to Hebrews 4, we're told this. I'll just read it for you, it's just one verse. Hebrews 4, verse 12 says, "For the word of God, the commandments of God, is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit and of the joints and marrow, and is discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart." So God can see into our hearts and our minds. Okay, so Jesus gave an example of this in Matthew chapter 12, so to keep a marker in Matthew 12. And let's go in at verse 24. Matthew 12, verse 24. And here again, don't seem to be picking on the Pharisees, but they're a good example. The Pharisees heard Jesus speaking and said, "This fellow doth cast out devils by Beelzebub, the prince of devils." And Jesus knew their thoughts and said unto them, "Every kingdom divided against itself." So Jesus could perceive and understand and see man's thoughts. So God's law cannot be corrupted. Okay, it's there. If we try to do it, then God will see into our hearts. Is the law enforced equally for everybody? Well, no, it's not, is it? Let's be honest. Often in cases in the newspaper where influential, wealthy or famous people are let off or given a reduced sentence, etc., or the case is dropped altogether or never even goes to court. We know that happens. Members of the royal family have been found breaking the law, and it just sort of is let to drop. But God applies his laws regardless of who a person is, what their station in society is, how rich they are. If you go to Acts chapter 10, and an example here, verse 34, Peter picks this idea up. "Then Peter opened his mouth and said, Of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation worldwide he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him." Okay? The word which God sent unto the children of Israel, preaching peace by Jesus Christ, he is the Lord of all. And that's what I'm teaching you. Okay? So God doesn't say this person's more educated, this person's got more wealth, so I'm going to be a bit more lenient on them. Nothing at all like that. It's the same across the world. So we've looked at the difference between God's law and man's. And the last thing I'd like to consider is, what is the ultimate goal of these two laws? What's the ultimate goal of man's laws? Well, also I guess it's to make the world a safer place for us to live in by dealing with people who are violent, corrupt and so on. And that's very commendable, isn't it? But as you've already seen quite clearly tonight, there's no end to the law. They go on and on and on, they change, it's complex. There's no end to it. We've witnessed how fragile their law is. So there isn't really an ultimate goal to man's laws. It's very much damage limitation, isn't it? But God's law, on the other hand, will lead to completion of his ultimate plan, which is a kingdom on earth where those who choose to follow his law and try hard to live by them, in God's grace will find a place in this kingdom. Now, I haven't got time to go into great detail on that, because there's many lectures on this subject given from this platform. But we know that God will establish a kingdom on this earth. It'll be a worldwide kingdom. So in conclusion then, the Bible makes it very clear that especially today there's vast differences between God's law and man's. And if you have a knowledge of this, it's essential to make a choice as to which one will govern your life. Remember, we're told to obey God's law, man's law at all times unless it contradicts to God's higher law. Man's laws are unstable, complex, open to corruption and lead nowhere. God's laws are the exact opposite. The question is, which one will you choose?